What it do, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review Snoop Dogg's album from 2002, Paid the Cost to Be the Boss. Now, this album is kind of an off to the side Snoop Dogg album. I think it's talked about not as much as some other ones like RNG and Doggy Style and like the blue carpet treatment and some of those, but it does have a particular noteworthy combination here that showed up, particularly on this album, which helped Snoop Dogg crest a lot in the 2000s, and that's his affiliation with Pharrell and the Neptunes. So Snoop Dogg and Pharrell collaborations wound up being quite large with songs like Beautiful, Drop It Like It's Hot, Vato, and like a couple other ones that were kind of maybe not singles but did have like the vibe of like just giving like a good combination. So oh yeah, Let's Get Blown and some of those type records. So Snoop Dogg and Pharrell, good combination. Definitely around this time 20 years ago, it was a good look because it helped breathe new life back into Snoop Dogg. It was especially when MTV was starting to become more rap oriented more and more often, with 50 Cent and Eminem kind of blossoming around that time. But Snoop Dogg kind of did. But the thing about like the No Limit years, to talk about like The Last Meal and No Limit Top Dog and some of those albums with No Limit, I kind of feel like Snoop Dogg had a nice, he had like a nice vibe that he had on those albums, but it was still kind of more gangster rap, and kind of it just didn't have the gloss that Pharrell kind of gave him later. Like I feel like Dr. Dre gave him like the G Funk and kind of gangster rap edge, but Master P and No Limit kind of gave Snoop Dogg kind of a more, but Master P and No Limit kind of gave Snoop Dogg kind of a more kind of growly type atmosphere about him, where he kind of had that more kind of low key kind of feel, where he was kind of making hits, but they just would be like one or two singles, and then that would virtually be it. And then like the Pharrell years, which was 2004 to 2006 and maybe 2008 if you count Ego Trip in, was kind of the more MTV and kind of more commercial in a lot of ways, besides like gin and juice and that type of stuff for Snoop Dogg, where it kind of took forth a new light, which kind of made him almost a pop rapper, but Snoop Dogg retained his edge there. So I kind of felt like it was good that the songs that Pharrell did with Snoop Dogg did not make him lose like his gangsta edge, because Snoop Dogg did come up as like a gangster rapper, but it was just a nice amalgamation. It was a good kind of necessary look for Snoop Dogg around this time 20 years ago that helped bolster him and get him back in the spotlight for a pretty solid second wind. It was just a definite kick ass kind of vibe. It's just too bad this album is not much to speak of besides that. It was a very trite two singles, which for a Snoop Dogg album, that's really surprising, especially around that time, because he would have been 30, 31 around this time. And it just is odd that he didn't try to bolster this album more. But I can see the reason as to why there was only two singles, because I definitely think Snoop Dogg should have worked with Pharrell way more. I mean, the problem with it was I don't think Snoop Dogg realized that his chemistry with Pharrell was going to happen until it actually did happen. So that's why there was only two Neptunes beats on here. But it's just too bad because there's really nothing elsewise to speak of hardly on Paid the Cost to Be the Boss beyond just like the Pharrell collaborations and maybe like a very small few other ones. That's kind of the same problem I had with The Last Meal. Apart from like the Dr. Dre beats on The Last Meal, there really wasn't anything else. Like maybe a Nate Dogg song here and there, but for the most part, The Last Meal was pretty lackluster apart from the 4 or 5 singles. Now, there were 4 or 5 singles on The Last Meal, but like I said, there's just hardly any sort of, it's a very skeletal production. It's a very skeletal promotion for this project, and Snoop Dogg was just trying new things. He wasn't with No Limit anymore. Dr. Dre is nowhere to be found on this album, and it's just trying a bevy of new things that were kind of shots in the dark as to whether or not they'd work. Because Pharrell wasn't exactly on top of the world. He had some hits in the early 2000s, but it wasn't quite where he was completely mainstream in like the fall of 2002. So that's kind of the thing. But I'll go ahead and talk about these singles, the brief two singles here. So the first single is from the church to the palace, and this song has a real crunchy kind of vibe, definite kind of slinky club bop here. I definitely feel like this is one that I would like Snoop Dogg to do way more songs like. There isn't many songs like this song on the album, and that kind of happens. Like this is such a stylish and emphatic kind of song. This is kind of Snoop Dogg more on his pimp type stuff and kind of glossy, not so much gangsta rap kind of vibe, but more kind of like just more like Dogfather kind of vibe, where he has a little bit more suaveness and sophistication, just kind of more edge, more gloss, more so than grime in this sort of sense, but I definitely think it works. Pharrell is on the song too, and I think that's a nice touch also that they kind of go back and forth in the bridge and that type of stuff. This really works as like a pretty kick-ass vibe. It was the start. It was the start of the Snoop Dogg and Pharrell collaborations, and it works. That's definitely the concept. That it's good chemistry, great kind of starch kind of beat. It's kind of tough to describe, but it's just a starch kind of beat, and it kind of works as like an emphasized kind of slinky, swaggering type club song and stuff. And the second single is beautiful. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard this. The comparison between From the Church to the Palace and Beautiful. From the Church only has like 4 million plays on Spotify, but Beautiful has 200 million. So that's kind of the difference. This is what I talk about, where this album is pretty much, for the most part, most people only remember this album probably for Beautiful. It's a great, real kind of summery, kind of summer vacation, spring break kind of Snoop Dogg song. Definitely kind of resort and kind of vacation like, very much hot weather and just kind of in swimsuits and that type stuff. It just works. Pharrell delivers a great falsetto hook on here. This is the start of these falsetto, maybe not the exact start. I mean, he was with Pharrell or he was with Mystical and Jay-Z, but this is the kind of concept of getting some of these where Pharrell was starting to really flesh himself out in 2003 and such. Really emphatic song, was an MTV staple, definite hit, probably VH1, BET, some of those places. Just real, the music video is probably real glossy and that type of stuff. Just established Snoop Dogg as like a pimp type persona and more laid back and kind of suave and sophisticated and that sort of thing. It's really emphasized, like the same thing with From the Church to the Palace. I would have really liked another similar song to this, but I just don't think there could have been anyone like Pharrell to have done it, because Pharrell was kind of different from Nate Dogg. I mean, prior to this, the only real hook singer that Snoop Dogg teamed up with to do hooks on these type of songs was just Cocaine. So you had Nate Dogg, who could give like the G-funk and kind of gangsta rap kind of hook on there, like he did on Doggy Style. And then you had Cocaine, who kind of showed up like 1999, 2000 with The Last Meal, and he kind of was like a more hardcore version of Nate Dogg. But I feel like Pharrell was definitely like the mainstream version, where it's like, hey, these are kind of some commercial ones that kind of, Nate Dogg definitely had that commercial tip too, but it just was without kind of the more gangster rap edge toward it. So it's just interesting kind of get that. And it worked. It's a pretty solitary hit. It's definitely a highlight, but I would have liked more songs that could have probably been like it. But like I said, I don't know if Snoop Dogg realized that this song was going to be a bona fide hit like it was. I have to complain about this album just because it's really particularly unnoteworthy. It's like a worse version of The Last Meal, but I have to give Snoop Dogg credit on this album just because he was kind of lagging along in his career. He was kind of staying afloat, but he did not have a hit album the size of Doggy Style apart from The Last Meal, which just was more known for its singles. I mean, without Dr. Dre and without Master P, I'm sure folks were like, well, how is Snoop Dogg going to flourish now? And it was like the example behind that, Snoop Dogg did have a very volatile trick up his sleeve with Pharrell, but apart from that, there's really nothing noteworthy. I think if those two songs, From the Church to the Palace and Beautiful, had not been on this album, I don't know how the Snoop Dogg kind of climate would have went quality wise, because most of this album, apart from the Pharrell songs, are quite bunk, and it just has a real terrible atmosphere towards it that I just really couldn't find anything noteworthy apart from three other songs, one of which is just kind of a one verse song. So there's just terrible production. I'm not going to get into every single song that I didn't like, but there's just pretty terrible production. These folks just didn't really get the kind of vibes that Snoop Dogg would have needed. They definitely didn't have the production standoutness of the Neptunes and that type of stuff. And there's just no one else that can step up to the billing like Battle Cat. And like, I do like Battle Cat. At least I liked him somewhat on The Last Meal, but I just couldn't find anyone else who was anywhere. Like Daz Dillinger doesn't produce any songs on here. I think Snoop Dogg wanted to step away from G-Funk. So Daz Dillinger doesn't produce any beats, and Dr. Dre is not on here. So it's just kind of a different kind of vibe where Snoop Dogg was having to kind of walk blindly to find some new climates, and it was just more shots in the dark that unfortunately didn't work. But at least he got the new combination with Pharrell that did work and get him some commercial fanfare. So I'm just going to go ahead and list the 5 songs out of 17 that I recommend to you. So the 5 songs would be Beautiful, Ballin', From the Church to the Palace, From Long Beach to Brick City, and Papered Up. Now, minus the two singles, Ballin' has a fantastic hook. Like, I think the Dramatics, who I think have teamed up with Snoop Dogg in the past, they really deliver like an excellent kind of soul, an excellent kind of suave and kind of laid back, real super mellow kind of piano song on here. And it just reminds me of something that you'd listen to in like a hotel lobby or someplace where you're having breakfast in a lounge and that type of stuff. I can also see it being played at like a bar where you're just kind of a little bit drunk, maybe you're not macking on some chick who's nearby, but just kind of having a few drinks at a bar, chatting with the bartender, that type of stuff. Just kind of reminds me of like a nice kind of mellow type song, just putting emphasis on the fact that you're doing as outstanding as you are. But the hook is excellent. I mean, that's on par with Beautiful as far as how good and how effectual the Dramatics made that hook. So it's definitely a nice one. It's kind of mellow energy in like a lounge, breakfast lounge, hotel lobby, something like that. And from Long Beach from Long Beach to Brick City is a nice kind of club type song. From Long Beach to Brick City is kind of a nice entry club type song, definitely a vanilla club type song, From the Church to the Palace, but just not quite as bombastic and as single ready. But it is like a nice album cut that's kind of a club type song that definitely a nice album cut that's a club type song that Snoop Dogg definitely needed. I feel like it just has a nice emphasis, just really kind of simple and real like good song to smoke to, smoke a swish or two, just a nice crunchy, comfortable club type song that works. It's kind of tough to describe the beat, but it's just a shade or two weaker than From the Church to the Palace, but still a good song. It's definitely one I recommend. One of the few club songs on here that works. And then Papered Up is just kind of a one verse song, but it has Cocaine on here, and he does a pretty great job on the hook. And it really feels like another hotel song. This is one that I would have to say is definitely like a kind of sophisticated, just fancy night, going to a hotel, that type of stuff, just taking in the sights and traveling and that type of stuff, just in a more, not quite as lounge-esque as Ballin' is, but definitely kind of in a hotel, just with the sophistication and that type of stuff. This gives me that kind of uh, travel exploits type vibes of it. And yeah, I mean, it's very like tepid kind of variety as far as that kind of goes. Like, I was kind of disappointed in the song Lollipop, which I thought because that would have Nate Dogg and Jay-Z on here that would have worked. I mean, the beat was just a little bit too emphatic on Lollipop. I definitely feel like that one, I know it was trying to be like this saucy kind of exuberant kind of ladies cut, but it just came off as like the raunch was just a little bit too emphatic to really kind of capture it. I felt like the beat, it was kind of trying to be like Jay-Z's Poppin' Tags type song from the Blueprint 2, but it just was a worse version of that. Jay-Z nailed that so much more effectually than Lollipop did on here. It was a waste of a Jay-Z and a Nate Dogg feature. And then there was also a really bad one that I feel like just with You Got What I Want, which had Goldie Loke from the East Siders and then Ludacris on here. It was just too bad that Ludacris, it was kind of a waste of a Ludacris feature just because Snoop Dogg and Ludacris team ups don't happen that much. I would have liked to have seen how that one turned out, but kind of a waste of a Goldie Loke feature from East Siders. And also, if you don't know him, he was on the song Laylo off The Last Meal. And Ludicrous. So this was kind of a bad combination. There's just some ones on here. There's just terrible production across the board. I mean, these folks just really, I don't know if Snoop Dogg's ear for beats was just bad at this time or just the concept of what he wanted he couldn't get across to the producers. It just is really like some of the choppiest and just overall kind of like pedestrian and just quite terrible production I've heard on any Snoop Dogg album. At least on The Last Meal, there were some folks that probably, Dr. Dre at least did not drop the ball, and there were other producers that I don't remember, like Daz Dillinger or folks like that, Battle Cat, some of them that had some decent stuff, and, there were some good beats on, like, No Limit, Top Dog, and some of those, but this is just, quite horrid. And, but yeah, just to say, I'm going to go ahead and score this album, me liking 5 songs out of 17. I'm going to give this album like a 2.75 out of 10. That's all I can really do with it because that's less than a third So this, I mean, I really feel like I almost want to give it a 2.5. I'm just going to give it a 2.75 out of 10. That's really all I can do with it. I should give it like a 2.25, but at least like the singles enough and what Snoop Dogg was trying to do, it's really not going to get any more than a 2.75. That's about all I can really go with it. I could give it a 2.25. I'm just going to give it a 2.75 out of 10 just to commend the the quality of the singles and just the fact that there is some decent, small, decent quality and like the very trite amount of album cuts that shine through. But there's just really hardly anything noteworthy to speak of beyond the Pharrell beats and songs, and that's really about the only trick that Snoop Dogg really has on this album. Otherwise, I almost wonder what would have happened had how the rest of Snoop Dogg's later career would have turned out. And it's not to wholesomely thank Pharrell, but just to kind of say, I mean, I do think things were kind of wondering. I was kind of wondering what was going to happen here. But 2.75 out of 10. The social score, I will give a 4.25 out of 10 because there are 5 social songs, like 2 club songs, and From the Church to the Palace, and then um, the other one From Long Beach to Brick City, and then like Ballin' is pretty good, and Papered Up is pretty good, and Beautiful is pretty good. That's just really about all this project really has. I mean, you might be able to find some other ones depending upon your taste in production and that type of stuff, but for the most part, this is quite a relatively stiff and kind of shortcoming of a project. This is really bare bones, skeletal, and just almost completely uneventful and noteworthy and unnoteworthy. So that's just kind of the concept there. I think in terms of the future, like Snoop Dogg last year dropped back on death row, so I'm kind of wondering about that. I'll have to check out some more of these, but I do feel like this barely. If you could get this album for like 5, 6, 7 bucks, I would say maybe it's worth getting those 3 or 4 songs. But it just does not have a lot to speak of, and it's just kind of you know like Snoop Dogg was just testing the waters. He was just trying some new things out, and he had to take some shots in the dark, and that's just kind of the concept about it. But it did result in small victories, but it just is not overcast like Snoop Dogg normally is.